The corridor outside the imperial war chamber did not have a name, which was unusual for a place that had witnessed so much history. Every antechamber of consequence in the Velthari Imperium had been named after something: a battle, a dynasty, a celestial event of sufficient drama. But this particular stretch of obsidian hallway, 300 meters long and carved from the volcanic bones of the moon Valeth Prime orbited, had simply never been assigned one, and the administrative staff had long since stopped trying. Names implied the place was waiting for something. The Velthari Imperium preferred to imply it was already done. The 7 candidates standing in it were pretending, with varying degrees of success, not to be nervous. Admiral Thesson of the Merc Confederacy was doing the best job of it, which was easier when you were 3 meters tall and covered in the kind of ceremonial medals that made your chest look like a small museum of violence. He stood near the far wall with his arms folded and his gills, 3 on each side of his wide, flat neck, cycling in the slow, deliberate rhythm he'd trained into himself over decades, the amphibious equivalent of controlled breathing. His species' emotional states were readable if you knew where to look. His gills said, "I have been in worse rooms than this." His eyes, fixed on the middle distance, said, "I am also not entirely sure that is true." Closer to the chamber's sealed entrance stood Commander Verisol, whose neural augmentation lattice ran in fine copper threads across her temples and disappeared beneath the high collar of her uniform in a way that always made people want to follow it with their eyes, which was partly aesthetic and partly because the lattice occasionally pulsed with a faint bioluminescent charge that the eye caught involuntarily. She was very still. The stillness was not calm, it was processing, the particular quiet of an overclocked mind that had too many inputs and had learned to manage them by refusing to give any of them to her face. The Pelari Collective occupied a section of corridor slightly apart from the others, arranged in a loose diamond shape. 4 bodies, 1 registered name on the Imperial Intake Manifest, which had caused the administrative intake officer a headache she was still managing 2 days later. They were not identical, the 4 of them, but they moved in the subtly coordinated way of a school of fish, small adjustments distributed across 4 sets of limbs that added up to a single continuous intention. One of them was currently looking at the ceiling. The other 3 were looking at the ceiling in support. There were 2 others, a Dorvian siege specialist built approximately like a reinforced storage container, and a Korathi signals officer who had spent the last 40 minutes pretending to review something on her data band while actually watching everyone else. This was a legitimate intelligence-gathering exercise. This was also what waiting in a very expensive corridor did to military minds. And then there was the human. He was standing near the middle of the corridor, not quite aligned with either group, in the way of someone who had found a comfortable spot and saw no particular reason to move from it. He had a data slate. He was reading it. He was, by every external indication, having a perfectly fine time, which was either extraordinary composure or the kind of fundamental unawareness of stakes that occasionally produced geniuses and more often produced very confident mediocrity. The intake system had listed him as Elias Voss, human, independent civilian contractor, and had then offered no further elaboration, as if the file itself had shrugged. He wore a plain gray jacket that had no insignia on it, no rank markers, no augmentation visible anywhere on his face or hands. His face was young, not young in the way that means ambitious and untested, but young in the way that makes experienced observers briefly doubt their own perception, the kind of young that doesn't seem to have received the appropriate memos about aging. He could have been anywhere between 25 and a well-preserved 40. He had, at some point in the last 20 minutes, apparently found something amusing in his data slate, because the corner of his mouth had shifted in a way that didn't quite become a smile, but was clearly its immediate neighbor. The corridor's bioluminescent threading pulsed its slow arterial blue along the ceiling. Somewhere beyond the sealed chamber doors, The Emperor's staff were preparing whatever elaborate technical architecture the assessment required. Thesson's gills cycled, Vera's soul processed. The Pelari collective exchanged an internal communication that flickered briefly across their faces like weather. Elias Voss turned a page. When the doors opened, not dramatically, but with the absolute confidence of mechanisms that had never considered the possibility of malfunction, a Velthari aide stepped through and informed the group that they would be asked to wait a further 12 minutes while calibration completed. She said this with the serene authority of someone delivering news the universe had already ratified. She asked if anyone required refreshment. Thesson said no. Vera Sol said no. The Pelari collective said, in overlapping sequence, no, 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 and then one of them said yes. And then they had a very brief internal disagreement, and then the same one said no again, apologetically. The aide looked at the human. I'm fine, thank you, Voss said, without looking up from his slate. Then he did look up as if something had occurred to him. Actually, is there a stylus available in the chamber, or is the interface gesture-based? The aide blinked her nictitating membrane, a Velthari tell that meant she was recalibrating her expectations of a conversation. Gesture-based, she said. Excellent, he said, with the warmth of a man receiving unexpectedly good news about a sandwich. He looked back at his slate. The doors sealed again. Verasol's augmentation lattice pulsed once, briefly, which in her personal biometric notation meant, I find this person interesting and I do not yet know why. Thesson's gills did something very small that, if you were fluent in Merc emotional physiology, meant approximately the same thing. The Dorvian specialist looked at the human, looked at the door, and then looked at the floor in the manner of someone reorganizing their assumptions about the afternoon's agenda. 12 minutes. The blue light pulsed in the obsidian. The corridor, which had no name, waited. Princess Velindra arrived 11 minutes late, which was not tardiness. Tardiness implied an obligation to be somewhere at a specific time, and obligations of that kind flowed in one direction in the Velthari Imperium. The aide who had been tracking her progress through the palace's internal monitoring system had simply updated the calibration window accordingly, with the practiced neutrality of a staff member who has learned that some facts are better treated as weather. She came through the corridor's secondary entrance with 2 attendants and the particular forward momentum of someone who has decided what a room contains before entering it. The first attendant was carrying a secondary data manifest. The second attendant was carrying the first attendant's bag, which meant he was functionally carrying a bag about a bag, a situation he had made his peace with. Velindra herself carried nothing, because she was the kind of person for whom carrying things was a concept that applied to other people. She read the room in segments. Thesson received a measured incline of her head. The Merc Admiral's record was substantial enough to warrant genuine acknowledgement, and she was not in the habit of wasting the currency of her disrespect on those who hadn't earned it. Vera Sol she assessed for a moment longer, something passing across her face that was adjacent to professional interest. The Pelari collective produced a very brief pause in her forward motion, the kind of pause a person makes when encountering an exhibit they hadn't expected in a gallery they thought they knew. Then her silver eyes moved down the corridor and found Elias Voss. He had put the data slate away. He was now standing with his hands in the pockets of the gray jacket, looking at a section of bioluminescent threading in the wall, with the expression of a man examining something mildly decorative in a hotel lobby. He had not registered her arrival, or he had registered it and elected to continue looking at the wall, which, depending on interpretation, was either a failure of situational awareness or something considerably more irritating. Velindra stopped beside her primary attendant, a young officer named Sorvith who had been assigned to her staff 3 months ago and had since developed a finely tuned instinct for which of her silences meant she was thinking and which meant something was about to happen. This silence, he assessed, was the second kind. The human candidate, she said not quietly, who submitted his application. Sorvith, who had the intake manifest on his secondary display, and therefore knew the answer was the imperial office, authorized by the emperor's personal seal, said carefully, "The formal submission originated through the standard advisory recruitment channel, Highness. He has no augmentation. Not visible augmentation, Highness. He is reading. He was reading a data slate in the anteroom of the Imperial War Chamber." "Yes, Highness." She looked at Sorvith with her flat silver eyes. Sorvith looked back with the expression of a man who has accepted that his job is to exist near difficult truths without endorsing them. "Pull his credentials file," she said. "I can do that. It was attached to the original intake." "I don't read attached files." Sorvith did not say anything. This was the correct response. The sealed doors opened then, properly this time, with the full authority of mechanisms enacting their purpose, and the aide appeared to escort the candidates inside. The chamber resolved itself around them in pieces, the star-mapped ceiling arriving first in the peripheral vision, then the scale of the tactical array, then the table, and finally the particular quality of silence that very serious rooms accumulate over decades of serious use. Each candidate was assigned a station. The stations were arranged in a configuration that was technically a semicircle, but felt, in the room's proportions, like standing at intervals along something much larger. The holographic arrays at each position were dark and waiting. The table between them was currently displaying a neutral navigational chart of a hypothetical system, because even the placeholder content in this room was doing something purposeful. The aide explained the protocol with the precision of someone who had explained it many times and had no intention of explaining it a different way. Historical engagements, modified for assessment, 17 metrics, no collaboration, real-time compilation. She paused for questions in the manner of someone stepping briefly near a door they hoped wouldn't open. Thesson asked 3 questions. All 3 were good questions, the kind that contained their own research within them, and the aide answered them with something approaching warmth. Verisol asked 1 question about holographic refresh latency that caused the aide to consult a secondary panel and respond with a figure that satisfied something in the commander's augmentation lattice, which pulsed once approvingly. The Pelari collective spoke in their overlapping way, producing a question that seemed to have several simultaneous subjects and arrived at a single syntactical destination, and the aide answered the part she was most confident about and nodded at the rest. Then Voss raised his hand. Velindra watched this. She watched it the way you watch something that is either charming or concerning and hasn't decided which yet. "Go ahead," the aide said. "The scenario 3 parameters," he said. "Are they locked, or is there flexibility in how the resource cascade is modeled?" The aide looked at him for a moment. "Locked," she said. "The parameters are fixed for all candidates equally." "Of course," he said pleasantly. "Thank you." He sat down at his station. He looked at the dark array in front of him. He appeared, from all available evidence, comfortable. Velindra settled into her evaluation position and opened her metrics display. She let her gaze move briefly to Sorvith, who was standing at the appropriate distance with his manifest and his expression of permanent low-grade apprehension. She did not look at the human station again. "The one in gray," she said, at the volume she had calibrated earlier in the corridor, audible to the immediate vicinity, not intended as announcement but not avoiding the possibility of becoming one. "He looks like a student who won a competition to be here." She paused and let her eyes move with deliberate leisure across the assembled candidates and then back again. "Is there a simplified orientation available for candidates who may need one? I want to be certain everyone is working from the same baseline." She said it with the specific grace of someone who has learned to insert the blade without being seen to reach for it. 2 of the candidates produced sounds that were not quite laughs. Thesson studied a fixed point on the table. The Pelari collective exchanged an internal communication that was unreadable from the outside, but which involved at least one of them widening their eyes slightly. Voss looked up, He looked at the princess with the expression he'd had in the corridor in the waiting period at his slate, unhurried, present. He held the look for precisely long enough that the room registered it, and then he turned back to his array, and the simulations began, and the first scenario loaded. And for the next several minutes, there was nothing in Elias Voss's face or posture to suggest that anything of particular consequence had just been said to him. Which was, Sorvith would reflect later, the first sign. He simply hadn't known at the time what it was a sign of. The first scenario loaded at 9:14 Imperial Standard Time, and by 9:31 it was already doing something that the aide's monitoring system had not previously encountered, which was generating results that required her to check whether the display was malfunctioning. It was not malfunctioning. Each candidate's workspace was visible to the room. This was intentional, a design choice made generations ago by an imperial military architect who believed that the experience of being watched was itself a variable worth measuring. Most candidates, across the assessment's long history, performed with the knowledge of observation pressing on them like a hand between the shoulder blades. They worked faster or more carefully or more demonstratively than they might have alone, and the 17 metrics were calibrated to account for all of it. The room was designed to produce a kind of controlled pressure, and controlled pressure produced information. Voss worked as though he were alone. Not performatively alone, not with the theatrical self-containment of someone demonstrating their calm, but actually, genuinely, functionally alone, in the way of a person so accustomed to their own company in high-stakes environments that external observation had simply ceased to register as a separate variable. He made decisions at a pace that was neither fast nor slow but continuous, a steady current of input and response, and the decisions themselves were what had started to cause the aide's monitoring system its quiet distress. Scenario 1 was a defensive extraction, a besieged position, diminishing resources, sustained assault from a numerically superior force. The historical commanders had defended. Every candidate in every previous assessment cycle had defended. Defense was what the scenario's geometry demanded. The forces, positions, and resource tables all pointed in the same direction, and that direction was: hold what you have and wait for conditions to change. Voss had looked at the scenario for approximately 90 seconds. Then he had begun doing something the metrics system initially classified as anomalous resource reallocation, before quietly recategorizing it as something it didn't have an existing label for. He wasn't defending the position. He was, as best the aide could parse it, performing a kind of structural audit of the attacking force's assumptions, mapping what the assault required to be true in order to function, and then reaching into the scenario's available variables and making 3 of those things false. Not forcibly, not with a counterassault that the numbers didn't support. He'd used 2 supply routes the scenario listed as compromised, not destroyed, a distinction the historical commanders had not found interesting, to reroute a series of logistics chains in a way that restructured the defended position's apparent vulnerability profile. The assault had continued. It had found nothing to grip. It had begun, in the simulation's modeling, to slow. Thesson noticed first, because Thesson had been in enough real engagements to recognize the specific quality of a situation that has changed without announcing itself. His gills cycled once in a way that was not quite alarm and not quite admiration, and was the specific combination of both that experienced military minds produce when they see something they wish they'd thought of. He did not look at Voss's display for long, because he was managing his own scenario and because he was too professional to stare. But he looked. Verisol's augmentation lattice flickered. In her personal biometric notation, this indicated rapid cross-referencing, which it was. She was running Voss's visible tactical inputs against the 17. Make certain she was reading the right candidate's data, and then she looked back at the number. The category was labeled Doctrine Deviation Yield. It measured the effectiveness of approaches that diverged from established tactical frameworks. Its expected range, across the full historical archive of this assessment, ran from 0 to about 60. Anything above 40 was flagged for review. Voss's current score in that category was asking the display to render a number in a font size it hadn't needed before, which the system was managing with the quiet dignity of software that refuses to be flustered. She looked at Sorvith. Sorvith looked at his manifest. His manifest did not help. He looked back at her with his permanent expression of structured patience. "The credentials file is available whenever you would like it, Highness," he said, very carefully, because he was a perceptive young officer and he had begun to understand what he was looking at, which meant he also understood what she was currently not looking at. "I don't need the file," she said, which was not true but was the kind of statement that makes itself true through the force of its own declaration. Sorvith said nothing. He was getting very good at this. Scenario 2 loaded for candidates who had completed Scenario 1, and Voss moved into it without a pause that the monitoring system could detect. This one was the core of our scenario. 11 years in the historical record, a siege that both sides had privately described as a loss while publicly calling it a draw, the kind of military engagement that had become academic shorthand for the concept of unsolvable problems. The aide had once watched a decorated Merc fleet commander spend 40 minutes on Korrivar before producing a result, the assessment classified as competent management of an unfavorable situation, which was the assessment's way of saying, "Yes, this is bad, and you have made it only somewhat worse." This was considered a reasonable score. Voss's first 12 minutes in Scenario 2 produced a result the monitoring system classified as reconnaissance pattern infrastructure conversion, which sounded, Sorvith thought when the aide's report reached his secondary display, like something a very boring engineer might do on a Tuesday. What it actually was, as the simulation's modeling engine worked through the implications, was the removal of the siege's primary leverage. The installation being besieged ran on external power supplied through a network of relay stations the attacking force controlled. Voss had spent 12 minutes converting that dependency to an internal generation system, using a window of vulnerability that the modeling engine assessed as 31 minutes during which the installation was exposed, and could theoretically have been decisively struck. The attacking force in the simulation's model had not struck during those 31 minutes, because no commander, facing a fortified position conducting what appeared to be an internal logistics reorganization during active siege conditions, would have read that as an emergency. By the time it was legible as what it actually was, it was done. The siege had no leverage. It was an expensive collection of ships maintaining a perimeter around an installation that no longer needed the thing they were withholding. The simulation projected. The attacking commander would wait 2 weeks for a concession that was not coming, reassess, find no good options, and begin the political process of withdrawal. 11 years to 31 minutes of acceptable risk. Velindra had stood up. She became aware of this after the fact, the way you become aware of having moved toward something interesting before the interesting part has fully registered. She was standing at her evaluation station looking at Scenario 2's resolution on Voss's display, and Voss was already in Scenario 3, and Sorvith was standing precisely where he always stood, doing nothing at all with a very specific deliberateness. "Sorvith," she said, "Highness." She looked at the display. She looked at the number that the system was rendering in its newly discovered font size. She looked at the plain gray jacket and the unremarkable face, and the hands moving through gesture inputs with the unhurried economy of someone who has been doing this long enough that it no longer requires urgency. "Pull the credentials file," she said. Sorvith pulled it immediately, which meant he had already pulled it, which meant he had been waiting, which was the action of someone who had seen this moment coming and had the fundamental decency not to say so. He transferred it to her display without a word. She began to read. The chamber was very quiet. Scenario 3 was loading on every station, the one the design team called the one nobody finishes. And somewhere outside the sealed obsidian walls, the Emperor was watching through means his daughter had never managed to locate. And in the bioluminescent blue of the imperial war chamber, the credentials of Elias Voss were arranging themselves in front of Princess Valindra's silver eyes like the answer to a question she deeply wished she hadn't asked. The credentials file was not long. That was the first thing that struck her. For a career of the scope the file described, the document itself was almost insultingly brief. A single dense page, the kind of compression that happens when the facts are large enough to require no elaboration. She read it twice, because the first time her mind kept stopping at various entries and requiring a moment to absorb them before it could continue moving forward. The Kessler Rebellion, 48 hours, coalition projection, 10 years minimum, undefeated record across 23 documented engagements. The word documented was doing meaningful work in that sentence, implying others that had not made it into official records for reasons the file characterized as operational sensitivity, which was the language governments used when the truth was inconvenient to their preferred narrative about how things worked. Retired at 35, the file gave no reason, it didn't need to. She had taken enough political theory to understand what an undefeated general does to a command hierarchy simply by existing within it. Every order given above him becomes a question. Every strategic decision made without his input becomes a liability. Every officer between him and authority becomes quietly aware that the mathematics of his record makes their position structurally awkward. You cannot promote a man whose competence makes him dangerous, and you cannot deploy him against enemies you might someday need as allies, and you cannot court-martial him for the crime of winning. So you negotiate a retirement with the careful delicacy of someone diffusing an event that technically hasn't happened yet. She closed the file. Scenario 3 had been running for 11 minutes on Voss's display, and the aide was no longer standing at her monitoring station with any pretense of normal posture. She was leaning forward very slightly, reading outputs with the focused attention of someone watching something that they will want to be able to describe accurately afterward. The Pelari Collective had abandoned the pretense of attending exclusively to their own simulation, and were watching his display with 4 sets of eyes that happened to be pointing in the same direction, which was as close as they got to unanimous agreement without a formal vote. Even Thesson had paused, not stopped. Thesson was too disciplined to stop, but the rhythm of his inputs had slowed in the particular way of someone whose primary attention has migrated elsewhere. Scenario 3 was the one nobody finished. She knew it from the briefing materials she had actually read, which was not all of them but was some of them, and the scenario's reputation was part of its design. A multi-front engagement with cascading resource failures, each collapse triggering the next in a sequence that accelerated past the point where any conventional response architecture could keep pace. Previous candidates had recognized the shape of it between 40 minutes and 90 minutes in, and had transitioned to loss minimization strategy, which the assessment rated as a mature and realistic response to genuinely unwinnable conditions. Voss had not transitioned to loss minimization. Voss had, according to the aide's monitoring output, which Sorvith had quietly routed to Valindra's secondary display without being asked, because he was developing an instinct for what she needed before she knew she needed it. Done something the system's categorization engine had initially labeled as cascading failure acceleration, which was technically accurate in the same way that describing a controlled demolition as building destruction was technically accurate, correct about the event, wrong about the intention. He had made the failures happen faster. He had taken the scenario sequence of collapses and he had pushed them, sequenced them deliberately, used each one's momentum to redirect force and resources in a direction the next failure would then expose as newly viable. It was, the aide would later write in her report, with the slightly dazed precision of someone transcribing something they had witnessed but not entirely processed, like watching someone fall down a staircase and arrive at the bottom having somehow rearranged the furniture to their satisfaction on the way down. The simulation's modeling engine, at minute 19, returned a result it classified as a decisive engagement, not a managed defeat, not an acceptable loss, a concentrated action that the scenario had no framework to have anticipated because it had been built out of 6 consecutive failures that no command architecture had ever previously considered a resource. The room was very quiet. Voss sat back slightly. He looked at the result. He made one final input, small, almost administrative, and then he folded his hands on the table and was still. It was at this point that the wall opened, and the Emperor came in. Sorvan III did not make an entrance in the theatrical sense, which was itself a kind of theater. The most powerful being in the Velthari Imperium had long since understood that walking into a room, and simply being entirely himself, was more effective than anything stagecraft could provide. He moved through the candidates with genuine and differentiated courtesy, the kind that costs nothing to give and accumulates enormous interest over time. Thesson by name and campaign. Verisol with a technical question about her augmentation architecture that made her lattice flash with something that, in her personal biometric notation, meant, "I did not expect to be seen this clearly today." He bowed to the Pelari collective in their precise form, an almost invisible thing, a quarter-inch of formal Pelari acknowledgement that one of them would later describe to the other 3 as the single most disorienting moment of the entire assessment, which was considerable competition. Then he reached Voss, and something in the room's air changed the way pressure changes before weather. "General," he said. The word landed in the silence and stayed there. Velindra watched her father's face and found what she had learned over a lifetime to read there. The specific quality of attention he reserved for things that genuinely commanded his respect, which was not a long list and which he guarded carefully, because an emperor whose respect is easily given is an emperor whose respect means nothing. He was looking at Elias Voss the way he looked at problems he was grateful weren't his to solve. Voss said the scenarios were good. He said Korovar had always seemed solvable to him. He said it with the comfortable ease of a man sharing a mild opinion about a moderately interesting puzzle. And the Emperor agreed with him about the 41 hours, and they had a brief exchange about the resource accounting in Scenario 3 that had the strange quality of 2 people discussing something in a language the rest of the room spoke, but had never been fluent in. Then the Emperor said the name. He said it the way her father said everything important, without preamble, without escalation, simply placing it in the room and allowing the room to do what it would with it. The ghost of Proxima. Velindra understood, in the moment that followed, something she had not previously understood about humiliation, that it has a temperature. It starts cold, the initial contact of the fact against the skin of your assumptions, and then it moves inward and becomes something warmer and more thorough. She had mocked him in front of decorated commanders from 4 separate civilizations. She had done it with the particular confidence of someone who has never had her instincts seriously questioned, and she had done it at a volume designed to be heard, because the height of her rank had always made being heard feel like a right rather than a responsibility. She stepped forward. There was no elegant way to do what she was about to do, and she had decided somewhere between reading the credentials file and the Emperor saying that name that the absence of elegance was the cost she owed, and that paying it fully was the only version of this moment that her father would recognize as her. She told him she had commented on his youth. She told him she had commented on his qualifications. She said it clearly to his face in front of the room. He said the questions were fair. He said it without generosity performing as grace, without the condescension of magnanimity offered from a comfortable height. He said it as a simple assessment of the tactical situation, the way he seemed to say everything. Youth and lack of augmentation were legitimate signals. He was an exception. The Kessler High Command, he added, had thought he was a diplomatic observer for the first 18 hours, which was either commiseration or the universe's way of demonstrating that even the category of people who underestimate Elias Voss was a category with distinguished membership. Her father made a sound she recognized. She did not look at him. She asked to observe the advisory sessions. She framed it as a request, which it was, because she had arrived at a moment in the afternoon where the careful exercise of her own rank felt like the wrong instrument for the situation. And she was finding, with the specific surprise of a first discovery, that the surrender of a bad habit could feel almost like acquiring a new skill. Voss looked at her for a moment, unhurried as always, present as always. She met his eyes and gave him the flat silver of her gaze and as much steadiness as she had available, which was more than she'd expected. "That seems reasonable," he said. "It was not forgiveness exactly. It was something more useful. It was the door of the next thing, held open without ceremony." She recognized it because she had seen her father use the same technique, the gentle refusal to close what could remain open. And she thought, not for the first time that afternoon, that the Emperor had known exactly what he was doing when he had not sent her the credentials file. He always did. The chamber's star map pulsed slowly overhead, the fleets of the Velthari Imperium moving in their long arcs across the obsidian ceiling, and Sorvith was already organizing his manifest for the debrief. And the aide was writing something in her report with the concentrated